As mentioned, I'm a program manager with the Environment and Energy Division at the City of Toronto, and I work alongside the Transform TO team, who's been responsible for our climate action planning. And in my role, I specifically focused on developing financing mechanisms needed to deliver on the ambition of our climate plan and raise the necessary capital needed to do so, as well as looking at governance approaches to better integrate climate consideration into city decision making. Internal carbon pricing is a fascinating tool that we're looking at implementing policy for here in Toronto. We believe it has the potential to make wiser, climate smart investment decisions here at the city. And while we don't have a policy in play just yet, what I wanted to share with you today were the results of our phase 1 study into the design and consultation work that we've completed thus far. Okay. As mentioned, Transform TO is Toronto's climate action strategy. It's a community-wide strategy towards achieving a low-carbon, healthy, equitable, prosperous, and resilient future for Toronto. It was unanimously supported by our City Council in 2017. It has emission reduction goals of 65% by 2030 and an 80% mid-century target as well. We've got some good news based on our 2016 greenhouse gas emission inventory. We've been able to reduce community-wide emissions by 33%, so we're about halfway towards achieving our 2030 goal. But we know that the work that lies ahead and getting to our 80% is going to be much tougher. Based on some economic modeling we've done, we know that the low carbon transition represents a pretty significant economic opportunity with an estimated $60 billion in investment until the 2050 mark, as we realize that low carbon transition. So just to sort of baseline everyone with some common terminology around internal carbon pricing, also known as shadow or corporate carbon pricing. And what it is, it's a tool to account for the costs of climate change by quantifying pollution into dollars and having this understanding built into options analysis or business cases. It's a price on paper which informs financial analysis when comparing different options. We express the external costs that are impacted to society from climate change, and we express those and through $1 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalents. One of the misconceptions is that carbon pricing is synonymous with a carbon tax, which is a false statement, because through this exercise, there's no actual fee that's paid or collected, by a government agency, let's say. But it does, from our early research and some modeling that we've done, is that it really does add value to the decision making by considering carbon impacts over an asset's life cycle. So the sort of genesis of this work began with through some political support from a city councillor and a directive from our executive committee of Toronto City Council to basically look at the merits of a policy, and if it deemed appropriate, we would bring back a policy and implementation plan. So it was politically driven. It wasn't something that had originated with Toronto City staff. In terms of policy drivers and what might compel a municipality in looking at this is it provides it fits within a risk management framework. So what it could do is potentially hedge a city like Toronto against some future compliance obligations that may be that we may be subject to in the future. And it would prevent stranded assets from happening. So for instance, if we're investing in landfill capture technologies and potentially may be subject to some sort of landfill regulations in the future, by having sort of a sight line into what what being able to quantify what those impacts are, and building them into a business case at the onset before investing in technologies would potentially steer us clear from malinvestments. Toronto considers itself a leader around climate mitigation and action. We have also aggressive corporate leadership targets related to our real estate, fleet, and other assets. And we think that this tool can help us to demonstrate leadership both corporately as well as to the community, with potential spillover effect where the private sector might be compelled to follow the city's suit. Carbon pricing has the ability to accelerate the deployment of low carbon technologies. And we're operating in sort of a climate today of greater sort of transparency and disclosure, and sort of demands from investors to better understand what greater climate information around projects that we're undertaking. So a policy like this supports that. So getting to our study, so phase one of our study has three components, and really what the objective is to introduce the concept of internal carbon pricing to city staff from various divisions, baseline everyone with a common taxonomy and definitions, and sort of arrive at a shared understanding of what might a policy look like. We hired a consultant, Mantle 314, formerly Zizzle Strategy, to facilitate this work. And our methodology was as follows. We undertook a best practice scan, looking at private firms as well as government agencies who had carbon pricing policies in place. We hosted a series of workshops with project management staff across a variety of divisions. And we did some project level scenario analysis to explore the extent to which carbon pricing analysis influences or switches investment decision outcomes. So, we're going to hear from Matt shortly on City of Vancouver, but this slide really just gives an overview of some of the governments who are already applying internal carbon pricing. The Government of Canada has such requirements already in place, New York City as well. So I'll leave that, I won't get too deep, but I'll leave that for future reference. Now, in terms of our stakeholders who we consulted, it was a broad base representing both like project management staff who are, working on building energy retrofits, biogas utilization, fleet procurement. But we also invited to the table staff who manage sort of financial processes at the city related to capital planning, as well as our budget process. So we had a sort of a unique group that I don't think we've ever really convened before around any particular policy. And we also, in addition to City of Toronto staff, we also spoke to the City of Vancouver, the Toronto Atmospheric Fund, as well as some of our external agencies like our transit provider, the TTC. So the stakeholder workshops, really the goal here was to gain insight on sort of the current perception of an internal carbon pricing and how roles and responsibilities may interact with a potential policy. So we want to understand, what are the current approaches to capital planning? What are individuals' roles in that process? How does one design or advance a business case, and how does carbon information and data factor in? And then what are the tensions one has experienced or might expect to experience should such a policy come into force? And really what we're trying to dig there is like, what are the cultural changes and the changes to sort of the existing business processes here at the city that we'd have to address in order for a policy like this to be successful? So some of the feedback we heard related to concerns about the complexity of process. For instance, a facility manager, was sort of scratching his head, just trying to understand, sort of where do we draw a line around, the scope of emissions, for instance, that would be applied in a policy, and how far down the supply chain would we need to quantify the emission impacts if we're looking at materials, let's say for a building retrofit. One of the things that we heard real loud and clear, and a challenge, I guess, of a big city with many operating divisions, is that there was no standard uniform business case process it appears though, a lot of city divisions have their own approaches. There's no standardization around that, and that we would need to sort of address that challenge if we were to take forward a carbon pricing policy that tried to standardize the quantification of carbon pollution and build that into those processes. There were also challenges related to some existing policies. For instance, in order for us to demonstrate that an investment in an energy retrofit at a city facility is viable and should be brought forward through our budget process, we need to demonstrate, cost avoidance, for instance, is not one of the things that the current policy properly accounts for. So we knew we'd have to sort of address some of the existing policies that are already in place in the city, which sort of are creating a little bit of frustration for this new policy. And then there were also concerns of the increased complexity as it applied to process. So, it might be easy to do carbon pricing for fossil fuels where it's pretty straightforward. But when you started getting into more complex, larger infrastructure projects like roads and bridges, it might get a little trickier. So next, in terms of our scenario analysis, now I want to point to, I believe Allison's shared, and we will be able to share sort of our full consultants report where we dive into 4 case studies, one related to biogas, building battery electric buses, geothermal installation, as well as the Toronto Green Standard for new construction. I'm going to shine a light on 2 of those, but definitely refer to our consultants report for a little extra information on this stuff, because I'm going to touch on it very lightly. So the first project we looked at was a geothermal installation as part of an existing building retrofit. We looked at the geothermal system in isolation. And as part of this scenario analysis, what we've done is looked at sort of business as usual, where we're not applying a social cost of carbon as part of our net present value calculation. In the scenario 2, we're applying a $50 per ton Canadian price, and then in scenario 3, we're applying closer to a $200 per ton price. And based on that analysis, what we, as presented in front of you, is that in scenario 3, with the highest impact and the $200 price, the decision is flipped, meaning that the costs are less than the life cycle benefits of undertaking this particular project. Secondly, the Toronto Green Standard applies to new construction in Toronto. I know it's a real busy slide here, but we have sort of a stepped performance standards as it relates to building energy efficiency and greenhouse gas performance. And it's sort of broken out by certain building typology as well. And similar to the previous example where we're applying sort of the low and then the higher, so the 50 and then the 100, the closer to $200 per ton cost per carbon, we see that the higher performance tiers, which essentially are net zero carbon buildings, the business cases become positive, and so that's what this sort of analysis shows. So, for instance, a high-rise multi-unit residential building at $200 a ton, we're able to demonstrate that that this is a positive NPV. And on the side there, those green boxes identify actually the break-even points, so that, for instance, at $59 or at maybe $177, a multi-unit residential building, we can justify the economics of that net zero building based on the standard. So our study findings, in the end, what the concept of an internal carbon pricing was really strongly supported across city divisions that we had consulted. However, there were some concerns. A lot of the first and foremost was this perception and evolving understanding. It's not standard practice for us to incorporate avoided cost into our business cases, and let alone like the, internalizing the external costs to society into an asset or infrastructure business case. It's just not standard practice. There's this lack of, overall, we found there was like really a lack of climate consideration that staff in divisions working on infrastructure asset projects, while they might, notionally identify that, investing in an electric vehicle, for example, that there's air quality benefits, but we don't sort of take the next step in actually quantifying what those air quality benefits are and building them into business cases. We also learned that there really is a lack of a common approach to developing business cases, which is one of the first things we would need to address here at the city. And then lastly, based on the scenario analysis, internal carbon pricing really does a job in boosting the business case for low carbon alternatives, particularly fuel switching, such as electrification, which is a good thing because our Transform TL, it's one of the key strategies of our climate action plan. So in terms of our study conclusions, what we arrived at is we sort of need to pivot our policy development to focus more on a broader climate lens, and sort of we define that as both an understanding for the greenhouse gas mitigation opportunity, as well as an assessment of climate risk, and that really should be the foundation and the necessary precursor before being able to properly undertake like an internal carbon pricing analysis. Because if we can't baseline a project and understand how different low carbon options might, how the economics for those other options might change, if we're unable to provide that basic assessment, then it just makes it that much more difficult to apply a price. So it really is the required precursor. And we also are seeing that there's a lot of other drivers. As I mentioned, our climate risk disclosure, where City of Toronto's done green bond issuances, and there's reporting requirements linked to that, and that this is sort of the right approach to take. Also, the federal government in Canada has placed a requirement that all infrastructure projects greater than 10 million and those within sort of those that have climate outcomes are subject to a federal climate lens. So we need to do this work in all instances where we're accessing federal infrastructure dollars. So it makes sense for us to sort of have this as a standard practice for all projects, irrespective of if they're seeking federal dollars or not. So it's really the climate lens, that GHG mitigation assessment and adaptation assessment, as well as carbon pricing, that this really is sort of the framework that we should be all working on together. So in terms of our next steps and sort of phase 2 of this study, we're going to reconvene with our divisional partners and sort of scope what a policy framework looks like for climate lens. With that, we'll be, developing a policy, the guidelines to support staff who are project developers and understanding how to apply it and what instances it applies, and as well as tools and staff training are all sort of part of this module. In the meantime, though, for some city divisions like the one that I'm part of, where we're a little more sophisticated around our business case modeling, we will voluntarily start applying a carbon price to all building energy and renewable energy projects, and encourage some of our other divisions to do so as well in the meantime. And then we'll be reporting out to our city council later this year on our progress to date. And then really this is part of like a sort of a long-term capacity building exercise. So we need to start, socializing this notion of a climate change, of a climate lens and internal carbon pricing concepts with our colleagues and senior management to get their buy-in, allocate resources for staff training and tools, decision support tools as well, and really be able to expand divisional capacities cross-corporately to undertake the climate lens assessment, because currently those resources reside, in one place within our organization. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks so much, Marco. I've opened up the lines. Does anybody have a question for Marco before we move to Matt from Vancouver?
All right, so Mark here from New Westminster. I had a fundamental question about the term a paper price on carbon. Most people, when they hear that, think it's not really something they have to pay, so they don't have to worry about it. It'd be like having a carbon tax that a driver could, conceptually pay, but didn't actually have to pay. It wouldn't affect their driving habits. But from the case studies, there are real dollars. If you use it in the evaluation, and then you use that evaluation to put more money into the lower carbon solution, that's really real money. So why do we call it a paper price, and why do we say we're voluntarily applying a carbon price?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is, thanks for bringing that up, because this is something that we're kind of struggling with, is sort of, the right messaging of these terms. And so we refer to it as a paper price because it's sort of a math exercise to understand what are these avoided costs. We're in Ontario, we're not subject to, well, we now are subject to the federal carbon pricing backstop. But that's already accounted for in our business case models. So we're, so it is not an out-of-pocket cost that we are paying, if we introduce such a policy.
If you were to buy the EV instead of the gas-powered car and pay more money for it based on the carbon price, isn't that real money?
Yes, and it's captured through our NPV analysis through the fuel savings. I guess one of the tricky parts is, like, in the way that we account for things, like, we don't have a line item in our budget that will acknowledge over time the fuel savings.
Yeah, and that's the entire challenge, and I understand exactly what you're up against. We're having the same thing here, but the problem that we're facing, and I'm glad you're using the NPV analysis. Would love to get some of those pro forma sheets from you. We're building a major new facility, and they're saying that we have a hard ceiling on the capital that we can invest, and that's going to, they think, exclude the energy building envelope, energy efficiency, and renewables components, because it's not within their envelope, their capital envelope. Now we know it's going to save tens of millions of dollars over the life cycle of the project, but in their minds, they're saying, well, that's our hard cap, and we can't think about the net present value, and that's causing lots of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that is irrespective of whether or not you even have an internal carbon price, right? Is whether or not there's a requirement to look at the total cost of ownership of an asset in your purchasing decisions.
Yep.
Does anybody else have a question for Marco? Otherwise, I'll move over to Matt.
I have a question. So I'm wondering about when you engage
This is
with
Hillary?
Yeah, from Saskatoon.
Thanks.
When you engaged with other divisions, you said that generally other divisions were on board with this right away. I'm curious if there was a bit more to that story, or how you kind of helped overcome perceptions that carbon tax is bad and this is too complicated and we can't afford to do this.
Yeah, I think, people coming into our the people who we convene as part of this working group, they came with the mindset that we have a climate imperative. The city has a $40 billion capital program, and we have $13 billion annually in spending, and that there's more we can do to be more sophisticated around achieving like climate smart investment decisions and better outcomes. And while it wasn't their suggestion or top of mind that internal carbon pricing would do that, I think they quickly came around to understanding that it was a decision support tool that would steer us in the right direction, such that the goals we have set for our city around this low carbon transition would be supportive, and that we're not looking back in 20 years time saying, wow, we're totally off course because we had no sort of oversight or consideration of climate into any of our decision making in a formalized way.
Would you suggest, Marco, that if you're in a city or a province that doesn't have the same level of support or commitment to climate action, that this could be, I would see this being quite well framed just as a risk management exercise?
Yes, there's a bunch of different ways that one could sort of frame what the the key driver motivation would be, and that would certainly be it in maybe in a jurisdiction where the low carbon imperative is not as prominent.